welcome everybody back to the show. Please help me welcome Annette Wimberly. Annette and I used to talk from time to time, and every now and then her ex-husband would come up. And every time I mentioned his name, what would you say, Annette?
I love him, I love him, I love him.
Every time, never failed. I love him, I love him, I love him. So one day I said, Annette, then why don't you go back to him?
And I eventually did, but I realized that he was still an abuser, and even though I prayed to God that he might heal him, I realized that my husband wasn't asking for the healing. So nothing really changed. He was still an abuser.
So you had the courage to leave once again?
Yes. I finally left, and I'm still gone. Thank God.
Marilyn, we find that happens a lot, don't we?
You know, I was just talking to my hairstylist the other day, and we were talking about that, how women just talk so much about how much they love him. And I cannot say that I can't relate to that. Obviously, I married my husband because I loved him. And obviously, I didn't want our marriage to end because when I took my vows, I took those vows for life. But after a while, it's like you said, you come to a reality, he doesn't want to change, and I'm out of here.
I have another question from an audience member. They want you to discuss verbal abuse. They say, isn't that another form of abuse?
Absolutely. There are basically three types of abuse. There's sexual abuse, there's physical abuse, and then there's psychological abuse. We have had women come in to our intervention center and say, you know, I wish he'd hit me. Because if I have a mark, or if I was black or blue or had a broken arm, then people would believe me. It's the continuous belittling and put downs and control over not letting you see your friends or not going to the grocery store when you want to. It's those psychological things that can do a lot more damage sometimes than actually a broken bone.
And that's true even if it's the opposite is true. We were talking about during the break the fact that men are abused. They are victims of spouse abuse, and we don't think about that as much. And women can verbally and psychologically abuse their spouse, their husband, their mate, just as easily as the opposite is true. You had something you wanted to say about that.
That's very true. That is so true. Generally, the people that we see, and the statistics show that it's women. It's women that are victims. We do see male victims, and we had a wake-up call last week, particularly at our center, with a male that has 3 teenage daughters. And all of our staff, and we have wonderful advocates at our staff at the center, really shook us up a little bit because it added a different dimension. And we said, you know, hey, we forget about this sometimes, but it's reality.
I have another question. We've touched on this a little bit, but someone wants to know, what are some of the early signs of physical, mental, and emotional abuse?
Well, the early signs can be very subtle, and I think Pam would agree with this. I'm sure that you guys teach these principles to the women at the center. In my case, one good example, we had a really large home. And there would be many times when, naturally, my husband and I would both be coming down the hall at the same time. He'd be coming this way, I'd be going that way. And I never thought anything of it until after everything was over, how many times he actually bumped into me in the hall and said, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. But those little bumps and shoves, and then there were other little things like he was a public speaker, obviously. I was also a public speaker. He was a minister, traveled a lot, and I did a lot of singing, traveled a lot. And there would be things like we would be at an event, and we'd be standing around with a bunch of people just like here, and he would just out of the blue make some comment about, you know, why you have to wear that yucky hairdo or something, those little put-downs. Would you agree with that, Pam?
The early signs, it's important to know that domestic abuse is all about power and control. It's one person's form of controlling another person's behavior, whether that's physical or psychological. And the greatest indicator that I can share with anyone is go with your gut. It just doesn't feel right. If you're in a relationship with someone that you get this little voice in the back of your head that said, you know, he shouldn't have done that, or he shouldn't have said that, or this just doesn't feel right. This isn't fair. This isn't right. That's probably the best indicator any woman or man can have.
Okay. What can be done to stop the abusive situation once the warning signs show up?
Leave. Leave. And I don't know why so many women ask that question. And I know whoever asked that question, you're probably in a situation and you're trying to make up your mind. Leave. It is not worth the degradation. It's not worth the harm that's going to come to you and your children. It's not worth the years that you're going to lose out on. This is where we make our mistake, ladies. And I'm just going to be very honest. I know there's some men in the audience. And we were talking about the wake-up call that I got when I was working in the emergency room. And we started getting men coming in who had been abused by their spouses. So the opposite is also true. This is where we miss it. We spend our time trying to change them, trying to make them better. We spend our time thinking, oh, if only people could see that other side of him. He is so charming. Of course he's got to be charming. He had to find a way to woo you in and draw you in, you know. And so what happens is we find ourselves rationalizing, oh, he's so wonderful. And yes, they have good qualities. Everybody has some good qualities. But if they're dangerous and if they're abusive, the way that you change the abusive situation is that you get out. If that person is not willing, I've only known one case, and it was a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine. Actually, it was the assistant pastor's wife and husband of the church that my ex-husband pastored. He became abusive at some point in time in their marriage and decided that he was going to leave the family and go get counseling. And he stayed away from that home for almost a year while he got counseling and got himself together. They've now been married for 20 years. Every time I hear from her, they're doing wonderful. But that's how the situation changes. If the abuser doesn't change, then you've got to get out.
One other question. I think a lot of people have this question. How can you help someone else that's in an abusive relationship?
We always tell people that if it may not be happening to you, but I guarantee you everyone in this room, male and female, knows someone that's in a domestic violence situation. The most important thing you can do for them is listen. Give them the opportunity to open up. Give them a safe environment to talk to you, a secure environment where they don't think that you're going to share that information without them knowing about it. And the other thing you can do is give them a hotline number. Share with them the fact that there are resources in this community and other communities where they can call and just talk to someone and find out, number one, their legal rights, which are very important, and find out what their options are that they may not have any clue of. So it's not important that you know the answers, but it is important that you know where to send them for help.
Marilyn, since I know your passion is purpose and destiny, how can staying in an abusive relationship block you from reaching your purpose and destiny?
Well, I know for a fact that if I had stayed in that abusive marriage, I would not be doing the things today that I'm doing today. Even just, of course, we had children in the marriage. My kids are now grown, and I leave it up to them to be able to communicate with them the way that they desire. And so one of the things that I have discovered is that he's still living in that past situation. He has not progressed. I thank God every day I'm not there. My life is so much more exciting. There are talents and abilities, and Diane said earlier when she was up here that when she got out of her situation, she discovered she had talents and abilities, and she just began to roll with it, you know. But many times when your focus is totally on getting out, how to get out of that abusive situation, you miss out on your own life. You miss out on your own person. You miss out on the person of your children because you're so busy trying to protect them. You don't want them to see the scars. You don't want them to hear the yelling. You don't want them to see the abuse. Until you're not developing the purpose and destiny of your own children. There's things that they could be doing, but they're afraid if friends come to the house that dad might be out of control, or mom, if the abuser is the mother. And so I encourage you, if you think that having someone to come up to you and say, oh, you poor thing, is important, let me tell you, number one, you endanger your friends. I've seen people, and we had a situation at our church a couple of years ago where a young lady was at a friend's house, and she kept doing this back and forth thing with an abuser, and he showed up at the house and shot everyone. And her best friend was killed. She survived. You're not doing yourself a favor when you keep inviting your friends in to support you, but you're not trying to get out of that abusive situation. Many times you're setting people up for a dangerous. Do you agree? You agree with me on that?
It is important to get out. I agree with you.
And the other thing that you need to do is you need to understand that life is too short to live it miserable. You've got too much going on in your life. Your children have too much to offer. There's too much happiness that you're missing out on for you to spend your whole life focused on somebody that is making sure that your life is a total miserable, bad time centered around him. Would you agree with that? Now, one of the things that I've been doing for years and I want Belvia to come back to the stage and help me with this. And I've been donating. This is exactly how this happened. When I first wrote my book, If He Doesn't Deliver, I wrote it as a support group book for my church, for the counseling department, because they were having women, the same thing. We experienced this in the Army, too. I'm retired military. Many times we had to put women out because they kept going back to their abuser, and you have a responsibility to take care of yourself. And I wrote this book because there was not very much out there at the time. There's stuff out there now for people in the religious communities in particular. And so I wrote the book, and I started donating it to my church. And everywhere I got stationed with the Army, I would donate my little copies that I did on my computer, donate to the spouse abuse shelters. And then one day, a couple of years ago, I started getting calls from Barnes & Noble saying, how can we get this book? People are asking for this book. And it kind of pushed me into the next dimension of my purpose and destiny of getting another level of excellence in the way that I packaged this material. And one thing that I have not done since I've been in Augusta, and I'm guilty, is that we have not donated some books to the intervention shelter here. And I know you guys have gone through some change. So we're donating some books to the intervention center. And the other thing, we have a surprise for everybody in the audience. Everyone that's here this morning is going to get a free copy of my book, If He Doesn't Deliver. And they're passing them out to you now. I want you to make sure that you use it as a support group book. If you have not experienced any abuse in your life, well, that's wonderful. God bless you. I wouldn't wish that upon anybody, but you may know someone, and you may want to have some ready answers to give them. The first part of the book, I tell my drama story, my soap opera life, how I got through my situation, how I was left to bleed to death almost in front of my children. The second half of the book, I answer those questions, some of them of which we've talked about here today. Why do women not leave? In a situation where it's a religious family, sometimes the answers to that question is different than maybe other women. But for most people, the answers are pretty much, and the questions are pretty much the same. You know, where was God? That's why I call the book If He Doesn't Deliver. Where was God and what was wrong with him? You know, two men in my life, two male men figures in my life, and I'm like, Lord, but there is a way out. And there are answers. And I want you to be empowered and encouraged. I want you to know that you can pursue your dreams, that there's life after abuse. If you ever invite me to come out and speak, I'm not going to be the type of woman that's going to pat you on the shoulder and say, oh, you poor thing, because that's just not me. My thing is, you know what? There's life beyond abuse. You need to get out, and you need to discover who you are. You need to find a new relationship with yourself, with your children, with your family, because let me tell you, life out there beyond abuse is exciting. You may not go on to be a talk show host. You may not go on to be like Diane and own several companies. She and her husband, her new husband, is a CEO over several big companies. You may not do any of that. You may just be happy, and that's not too much to ask.